Welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is the latest in our series, which has turned into a long series and very well attended. It's been very fun on Ask the Experts, so that you get a chance to get personal advice from someone. And today we have Maraea Harris talking on pruning native trees and shrubs. I'm very grateful to her for doing this. And she has a very interesting business, one that many people ask about. So when she starts, I hope she'll tell us all about it. Well, our format will be for her to present. Send any questions you have in the chat. I will then read them when she's finished her presentation. And if there's any time before 7:30, we can open up the mic for other questions. So please take it away.
All right, thank you, Margaret. And everyone, my name is Maraea Harris, and let me share my screen here. First of all, thank you, Margaret. I've really enjoyed this series personally. I've listened to quite a few of the presentations and missed some, but I hope to watch recordings, and I've gotten the resources. So it's been very educational for me as well. So, and thank you for everyone for attending and submitting questions for those of you that did. I know that Zoom, there is such a thing as Zoom fatigue, so I appreciate people making the time with so many options available these days with all the education resources out there. So this is a big topic, and I realized after I told Margaret that I would do it how big it was for Zoom, but I'm going to take a crack at it for an hour and hopefully give you some information, and if we don't cover something, I'll provide my information so you can try to reach me offline for questions. So I'm calling this Pruning Basics, the what, why, when, and how of pruning, parentheses on native trees and shrubs. The things I'm going to talk about are just generally good pruning techniques, and that will apply to native trees and shrubs as well. So I'll put a focus on some of the specific trees and shrubs, primarily shrubs, but I will touch on trees as well that we'll see in our landscapes locally as more people are using native landscapes. And as Margaret so graciously mentioned, I do have my own business. It's called Metro Garden Works. I do really a mishmash of things. I'm an ISA certified arborist. I'm a horticulturalist. I'm also a Chesapeake Bay landscape professional. So I do a range of things from helping people maintain their native landscapes, which are things maybe they've had a professional install or they've installed over time but are just having trouble keeping up with, to just going to people's sites and walking them through their landscape and talking to them about each of their trees and shrubs and helping them understand things that they can do better, or things they may want to change, or just help them understand what they have in their landscape. So that's sort of what I do in general. But if there's something you're interested in that you don't see on my website, or you don't know if anyone else will do it for you, you can check, and I'll let you know. That's the good thing about doing your own thing. You can kind of decide what you're willing to do. So that said, let's jump right in. So, I guess everyone's here, and I assume everyone is here because they have something they want to prune, but the reality is, do you really have to prune? And actually, the answer is no. We don't have to prune anything. There's no specific desire for any plant to want to be pruned. But the reality is we're humans, and humans often have a tendency to want to make things look a certain way, often for their own desires. Maybe not everybody has the same aesthetic, but often we would like things to be to our liking. So that's, I'll jump into the basic reasons I hear people want to prune. The most common, I think, is that people are not expecting plants to get to the size that they do. When they put them in 5 years ago, they were tiny little things. What are they doing? Sometimes things are planted in places that are affecting your ability to see out your window, enjoy that view of the birds out your kitchen window. Sometimes it's because plants don't look very good. It can be dieback, it can be various things, but these are some of the reasons I hear. Maybe these are some of the reasons you're here. If there are other reasons you've wondered, should I prune this shrub? Feel free to put it in the questions. And as Margaret said, we'll kind of run through those. I hope to hit questions that people have already pre-asked, so you don't have to ask them again unless I don't get to it. But if there are other reasons that you've encountered, let me know. Just thinking about pruning and if it can actually fix some of these problems that I've just talked about. you know, things growing much bigger than you expected to. Sometimes, especially with shrubs, it's possible to make them smaller. I do encourage people, if you're looking at really big size differences, that you consider something that maybe is more appropriately sized for where you want it. I see this often with hollies. That's not necessarily native, but people often have lovely hollies that are planted with the house, and they get rather large. Your landscape, you know, is much bigger than it was when you moved in, or than when the house was built. That's tough to change because plants mature and the landscape is going to evolve. You know, if you're in charge of your own landscape, or if you're planting something new, definitely read the tag, and it's the size on there should be listed. And if you don't see it, make sure you look the plant up. Hopefully they give you enough of the name to look up, and actually look at the, you know, your sizing between your plants and say, hey, is this actually 8 feet between plants? Because that's what it says it's going to get to. And you can always put little things in between in the meantime, like, you know, perennial flowers or things while you let things grow in, but that'll save you some headache in the long run. About looking out windows or doors, again, yes, usually there are some things we can do to try to direct them away, especially if the plant is not too mature. And I'll cover some of these techniques as we go. Health of plants, definitely pruning should be the first step to helping improve cultural conditions if you've got some pest issues. I always recommend, I am not a big pesticide user, but sometimes there are reasons you might use them. And before you would even consider that, you know, pruning to improve the cultural conditions, light flow, light penetration and airflow, that's definitely the first step. Some things you can't fix with pruning. Phytophthora is an example of a pathogen that's soil-borne. So you may see the dieback in the plant and you may prune the dieback, but it's going to come back in another part of the plant likely. So, but pruning does help you understand disease progression, even if it's not something that's able to stop the progression. So let's get to the what. The what of pruning. It's really important that you identify your plant. This is useful information to understand the way it wants to grow. If you can get cultivar information, that's also very important, because many cultivars, cultivar stands for cultivated variety, and usually that's something that's produced in the nursery trade. It's a cloned species, so usually they found a plant, they like the way it grew. An example would be redbud forest pansy. It has red leaves. People like that. So they've cloned this plant so that they can ensure it will have red leaves. Some cultivars are designed for specific size requirements. This is true for many natives, and you'll find varieties that are shorter of many things. So if you know what cultivar you have, that's helpful, because a Inkberry gem box gets to be a different size than the standard Inkberry. So those are things that might be helpful to you to know, is this something that really needs my attention? If you're not sure what your plant is, you know, take a look at it, watch it. You know, I know it's hard for people to wait, but if you've paid attention to it over time, look at when it blooms. You know, in our area, things are pretty dormant at the same time. Evergreens might have a slightly different growth cycle. You can look at how your plant grew last year. I have a little link here. I've shared some resources with Margaret that she'll share after, and this is one of them. It's just something to help you kind of understand how the plant grows. I mention this because it might help you determine whether or not something blooms on old wood or new wood, as an example. So this explains sort of how you look at whenever you see these lines that go all the way around. They're called bud scale scars. So this is 1 year of growth. There's this bud scale scar and then another year of growth. I also use that in client sites to understand how vigorously is the plant growing. If somebody's asking me to look at a plant, I may want to see how much growth has it put on in the past couple of years as a general indicator to me of how vigorously it's growing. And if I'm going to prune it, and if it grew 3 feet last year, if I only cut off 1 foot, obviously it's going to exceed my 1 foot cut back in 1 year. So those are just indicators that I use to think about what I might do with a plant. Once you've identified what it is, consider what the plant is and where you want to plant it. Is it going to fit where you want it to grow? And if it's not, and you're willing to put in the energy, time, money, whatever you want to put in to prune it over time, is it going to tolerate that kind of pruning? Because some plants will take a little bit for a little while. Some plants will take a lot for a long time, and other things just give up on you the first time. So think about that before you invest your resources in it. Why do you need to prune? We've talked about this a little bit, and the most common things I see tend to be aesthetic. clearance off sidewalks and roadways and things, or safety. Those are also important reasons that people want to prune. None of those are necessarily health related. We talked about the health and improving the actual cultural environment around the plant. You often see this in landscapes where things are planted very closely together, and the plants really benefit from a little bit of opening up for airflow and light penetration. And as I mentioned, for the sort of before any application or further pesticide use, trying other techniques such as pruning can help. I did get some questions about trees, and I will answer questions about trees, but trees are a very special case. And I say this because they are much longer lived than shrubs, and they suffer a lot more from poor pruning than a shrub does. If you cut an azalea really badly, you know, always just cut it back to the ground and it'll grow back. Larger trees, if you make really detrimental cuts to them, it can shorten the lifespan of the tree greatly, and can often create risks that weren't previously there because of the decay. So I'll cover some topics on trees, but I would definitely suggest reaching out to a certified arborist if you're looking to do something with a tree. I want to say that that's not the same as a tree company. There is a reference on the references that I gave to Margaret. The ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture, keeps a list of certified arborists, and some work for tree companies, some are independent, some work for state organizations, but everyone should be listed there that's a certified arborist. Got lots of questions about when you should prune. In our area, that's generally mid-February into July. That does not mean, what that means is you can safely prune the plant anytime during that time, and you shouldn't affect its health. If you do something like a dormant pruning, that would be in the spring before it's put on a lot of growth. Sometimes that's called it has a rejuvenative effect, because the plant, you prune it and then it puts on new growth. So it's going to grow back from what you prune. Summer pruning is also often considered reductive, because once you prune the plant in, let's say, July, there's not going to be a lot of new growth put on. So if you have let's say a holly, a yaupon holly, and you prune it in July, the size is probably going to be smaller longer, because it's not putting the new growth on right away. If you're pruning a lot out of a plant, do it on the earlier side of that time frame that I mentioned. So mid-February into July, prune it earlier in the season, March, April. That way it has time to recover, put on the growth it needs, and be ready for winter. The caveat to that, which is what people often notice, is if you're dealing with a plant where the bloom or the fruit display is something that's important in your landscape, you need to watch the plant or know when it flowers. And you usually have about 6 weeks or so after flowering to do your pruning, and that will still give the plant time to put on new flowers, not new flowers, new growth that will contain the flower buds for next season. And the same, let's see, for Winterberry, you would want to prune Winterberry the same. Right after flowering, you'll get rid of some branches that may have had berries this year, but that's the window you would need to prune, so those new branches that grow will have the ability to flower next year. I don't know if I mentioned it in here. I'll mention it here. Generally, if something flowers before June, you can consider that something that blooms on what they call old wood. That means that the plant produced that wood last year, and it set its flower buds actually at the end of last year. And usually they hold them all winter. And then in the spring, before June, they're able to put on the new growth to bloom. If you have a plant that blooms after June, that's what they would call a new wood bloomer. That means it puts on its new growth, develops the flower buds, and blooms all in the same calendar year for us usually. June blooms from June to August, as opposed to rolling over the year, which is what old wood bloomers do. In these examples I have here, azaleas are that varies. Native azaleas are a combination. Some native azaleas are old wood bloomers, some native azaleas are new wood bloomers. And winterberries, they flower in the spring. Fringe trees flower in the spring. Zoom is in my way, so I can't see the last thing. Redbud flowers in the spring. So those are all old wood bloomers. So you would want to, it doesn't mean you can't prune it in July, but that means you'll affect how many flowers you see in the following flowering season. All right, so this is the biggest part, the how do you prune? So I have quite a few slides, and I'm going to try to hit, I've tried to talk to specifically to some of the questions that were out there. So we'll cover, we're going to cover the generics, and then the generic pruning practices, and then I'll go into some species specific techniques. So we talked about knowing what you're pruning. In addition to that, the next most important thing for homeowner or professional is know why you're pruning and get your objectives set before you start pruning. It's very easy to get very involved in the pruning and then realize that you've done more than you anticipated without actually solving what problem you were trying to solve. So set those objectives before you dive into that. Look through the plant, get out anything that's dead and diseased first. Some people had questions about pruning out crossing stems. For trees, that's generally, with exceptions actually, with trees, pruning out crossing stems is important. For some native species like Itea, Viburnums, witch hazels, which is Hamamelis, if you try to prune out crossing stems, you're going to prune out more than 50% of the plant because it just grows lots of new growth. So it's not always a necessary objective in each pruning cycle. You might prune out crossing stems every other year. It depends a lot on what the plant looks like. We talked about setting that objective, whether it's reducing height, removing off of a walkway, making sure it has, let's say, 10 feet of clearance for a driveway area. Once you've set that objective and you've started on it, step back periodically and think about it and remind yourself of it. Write it down, whatever you need to do, and see if you're on the right track. It's very easy, especially with multiple objectives, like I want it off the walkway and 10 feet above the driveway, to cross wires, and then you can end up taking out more out of the plant than you intended to. Doesn't necessarily mean you'll kill the plant, but it might look wonky for a little while. And I know that scares people to have wonky looking plants at the end. So, and in general, you're going to see in some of my pictures, I don't have it a lot, but if you can prune to maintain the natural form of the plant, you're going to end up with better results. You'll have a more natural appearance. You'll have a healthier plant. That doesn't mean that you have to keep it wild looking or even the same size. You can reduce its size, you can remove it off walkways and still maintain its natural shape. But you'll end up with a healthier plant. And to be honest, your pruning tends to be reduced if you do it that way. The opposite of the natural form of the plant would be shearing, for example, like shearing of azaleas. Azaleas, if you go somewhere like, again, these tend to be non-native, but the Arboretum may have some of the natives. Meadowlark Botanic Garden definitely has some of the native azaleas, but the real good environment for an azalea is this spreading sort of area where it can expand. And that's often not where we have them planted. So the shearing, though, will end up with a lot of dense growth at the tips that ends up causing more disease for the plant. So we can talk a little bit more about shearing here as we go along. So many folks were wondering, well, if I want to achieve a specific response in the plant, what if I want to direct the growth, of a small plant? Regardless of what you're trying to achieve, whenever you prune and whenever you cut a plant, understand that you're going to induce a response in the plant. What that response is depends on how the plant is arranged. We'll talk about it here in a second, but try to understand what that response is before you prune it so you know if you're actually achieving your objective. This is not my diagram. This is from an extension publication, I think University of Georgia, it's listed there. What I like about it is it shows the different arrangements of plants. So this is what's called an alternate bud arrangement. Many, many plants are alternate, but often they'll call it leaf arrangement because that's what we see. But I'm talking about it as growing points because when you're pruning, that's what matters, is where is it going to grow from. So if there were leaves here, right underneath the leaf is a small area, the node where the new growth is actually going to occur. So trees, oaks, red buds, we've talked about, those are all alternate. Shrubs, we've talked about Ilex, the Inkberries, Winterberries, those are all opposite. It means that the leaf starts on one side, there's a space, and you'll find a leaf on the other side. Not directly across from it, it'll be up and on the opposite side. The space between them could be very short, and often on the same plant, in some places it'll be short, and some places it'll be longer, these distances between the leaves. But what they show here is as you make that cut where this dashed line is, the 2 points it could be more than 2, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to use the 2 here. The 2 points prior to that are going to grow. Sometimes it's 3 points, but in general, the one that grows the most is the one right behind where you cut it, and maybe even one further back. This is an example, the next example of what's called an opposite bud arrangement. Plants, native plants that have this arrangement, fringe tree is one. Hydrangeas are, but they're actually, viburnums are a good example of opposites. So those leaves, when you look at the stem, are going to be directly opposite each other. As they go up, they might turn and be opposite in a different plane, but they will still be opposite. There will not be one leaf unless one fell off. When it was growing, it was there. And those will be opposite each other. So this cut that they're showing induces growth in these 2 points, the 2 at the same location on the stem, and sometimes even before that. They don't have addressed here whorled, which is another world, depends on how you say it, but that leaf arrangement has more than 2. So it's hard to show in a flat picture like this, but imagine that you see these 2 stems here, there would be a third one kind of on the other side of this wishbone. Plants that have that arrangement would be hydrangeas, and fringe tree, although it's opposite in some sections. So often plants that are opposite sometimes will have whorls, or even plants that aren't opposite will have whorls in some areas. Azaleas are a good example of whorls where their flowers are. If you take a close look at azaleas, they're going to have where often like 5, and there's a flower at each tip. That flowering point is a whorl. So understand the plant. That's another important reason. Even if you don't know the name of the plant, which would be a good idea to know, but if you don't, you can at least understand its leaf or growing arrangement. And you could look at it and guess, if I were to cut here, where would it grow? So that's what you can expect when you cut a plant, whether it's a tree, shrub, and that's just based on the way the growing points are arranged. Very rough guidelines, because again, you've got to look at each plant, but I'm trying to give you some sort of general tips that you can use across before you look at your specific plants. This is a very general guideline. This is published by the International Society of Arboriculture. 20 to 25% removal of the canopy of a tree is the maximum they would recommend. And 20% is for a mature tree, even less for a very mature tree. And I would say even less for an urban tree, because they have suffered so much damage that it's unlikely they can take a lot more. But in general, you only want to prune. Don't call anyone out and say, hey, I want 25% of my tree taken out. Only take out what's necessary to achieve your goal. And in mature trees, again, they're often hanging on by a thread as it is. So taking as little out of those as possible. Shrubs are a little more forgiving, and you can, take 30% out. That's again, a rough guideline. The reason they use 30% is because if you really want to achieve a pruning goal, like change the size, if you take more than 30%, you're going to get a lot of new regenerative growth. And that obviously is counter to your goal. That said, if you wanted to do a rejuvenative pruning, which is something that's often done with azaleas or forsythias, one is sometimes native, forsythia is never native, but let's say you have examples of those in your landscape. Those are 2 plants you could cut to the ground, and that's more than 30%. They will survive it and they will regrow from the roots for the most part. Whatever you're trying to do, we talked about having a goal. Making as few cuts as possible to achieve that goal is going to be better in the long run for the plant, because every time you cut a shrub or a tree, it's an entry point for decay. The tree or shrub has to seal that cut over. And while it's sealing that cut up, there are all kinds of fungi and decay pathogens just generally hanging out, and they're able to enter the plant through that point. Something that comes up a lot is water sprouts or suckers, the growth either on the ground from the root system or in the tree off the branches that usually go just straight up. I will prune these, but before I would do anything with them, I would investigate why they're occurring. A tree or shrub often puts these out because it's responding to some sort of stress or damage. So if you see this occurring on a plant in your landscape, before you just cut it out, you might look around and see, why might the plant be doing this? I can give you some examples of reasons that it happens in trees. The sprouts, the root suckers, often trees have their soil mounded up too high around the trunk. You should be able to see this nice flare in trees that does this. If you have your landscape and then you have a pencil tree sticking out of it and you have sprouts at the base, that's often root growth that's in response to that. Suckers in the aerial sprouts, they call them, that are on the branches. Often it could be if you had something like a sapsucker that was has put wounds on the tree, it might respond to something like that. Sometimes a branch is broken and snapped something else. Sometimes you've taken too big of a branch and the response from the tree will be to send those out. You can wait to take some of those out if you want to investigate what that is. Tree topping. Let me take that away so everybody can see what it looks like. I'm seeing this more and more in this, just generally in suburban environments. This is not an acceptable pruning technique for any kind of tree that I can think of. So even if your neighbors are doing it, I'm going to put out a PSA, don't do it. So there you go. So racing through. So we talked about making your cut. So we know where it's going to grow once we cut it. Where should you cut it to? We looked at the buds. This is the example here where it's a promising bud. Why they have the word promising is if the bud looks flaky and old and cracked, that's not promising. That one may not take meaning grow after the cut. So find one that looks good, that points in the direction that you want it to go. So this one, if for some reason this first one they're cutting to looks dead, this one looks good and your walkway is over here, then prune to this one so that it goes in the direction you would like it to. Another option you can do is to cut back to another branch. That's also considered a growing point. So if you wanted to reduce the height of this, you could cut to this branch. An important caveat to that is they say a promising side branch. The reason they say a promising is that it should be sized at least 1/3 of the size of the other branch. It could be greater than that. But the reason they say that is if you cut back to a really tiny, just think of like a hair-like branch, it will not be able to absorb the energy that the plant is now going to put into that branch, and often that'll kill the branch. So you want to pick something that they're calling promising. And I'm saying is 1/3 diameter rather than promising. And an unusual growing point that maybe people don't think of is the ground. You can actually cut something to the ground and encourage new growth from the roots as opposed to somewhere else on the plant. And we can talk about some ways you might use that. This, however, does not apply to tree pruning. I would generally not prune trees to the ground to achieve anything. And this is a big topic, so I'm just gonna give you a teaser on it. And there are lots of resources that I've given Margaret. There is this idea of branch collars. This exists on shrubs too, but they often talk about it in reference to trees. This is the best place to cut back to. So when we talked about cutting a branch back to the main trunk, let's say this branch is going over your walkway and you'd like to get rid of it. And it's not, a 12-inch to 12-inch branch. 12-inch diameter branch. It's a small branch. You should be able to see what's called a collar. It's not always visible on all species. But in this picture, it's this bulge that's on the trunk. And you cut just above that so that this tissue continues to grow and eventually seals that pruning cut. And we've all seen this on trees in the forest or well-pruned trees where there used to be a cut and now it's kind of a little seam that's left over. This is an important thing related to the compartmentalization of decay in trees and shrubs. This is a concept that was pioneered by a Forest Service pathologist, general guru in agriculture called Dr. Alex Shigo. He's since died, but his research lives on. There are some resources in the references, kind of geeky sometimes, but it's interesting to read about. And CODIT is an important thing to understand for arborists because it dictates how a tree is going to respond to wounds that are created. Cane pruning. This is a technique you'll read about. So I wanted to show a diagram of what it looks like. I would say that this could be used for some things like viburnums, all kinds of viburnums, native viburnums, Itea, Itea virginica, is that maybe the sweet spire, and Physocarpus, which is 9-bark. That's something you can use. They're using it to rejuvenate to some degree by taking the oldest canes out. I also use this description for a technique if I were going to reduce the size of something. I might take the tallest ones out. As always, get the disease stuff out first so that you see how balanced your plant is. If you take this whole side out because everything's dead, that might change the way you prune this side out. It might change the number of branches you take out. But this is a technique you can use where you're taking out either the 1/3 of all the stems that are the tallest, the oldest, those are the two main reasons I could think of using it. But if you just want to keep something smaller in general or in a space, rather than waiting 5 years and then hacking the whole thing back, every year you can take a third of the oldest or tallest, and it'll keep the shrub smaller overall. You'll get that new growth from the base. So instead of this being here, it'll grow new, and it'll take a couple seasons for it to get to the height that it becomes a problem for you. So you can actually reduce your pruning time as well. This is another topic that's sort of hard to cover in this time period. Young trees and suburban environments. Good pruning for a tree when it's young, and I think this is something that homeowners don't think about very often. If you can do good pruning for a tree while it's small, you can really avoid a lot of conflict and more harm to the tree later. The basic idea behind it to some degree is called structure pruning, although this is also used for forest trees, urban trees in storm conditions. Ed Gilman with the University of Florida Extension is somebody who's covered this topic extensively. That's also in the resources. He has a lot of great videos, a lot of good diagrams. What I'm hoping you get out of this is, besides learning something, that you can take some of these resources outside with you to plants and actually look at them and think about how you want to prune them. But you're going to actually have to get out into the landscape, unfortunately, to do it. And I wish I could be there walking with you now, but we'll do Zoom for now, and we can follow up with questions later. There were quite a few questions and so little time. So what I'm going to do is actually talk about the techniques I've talked about and talk about, I don't want to say problems with plants, but some of the things I see commonly in landscapes and how you can solve them with pruning. And hopefully that answers some of the questions you guys submitted along the way. This is a species I'm starting to see a lot in landscapes because it's an evergreen, and there aren't a lot of native evergreens that can be used in sort of a formal way sometimes. So this is Ilex, Glabra, Inkberry, holly. We talked about identifying the plant. Knowing how it wants to grow is important. This plant, if you don't select a cultivar, wants to grow to 6 to 8 feet tall. In good growing conditions, all of these things at the base are going to be suckering growth. So that's new growth coming up from the bottom. One problem that happens with this plant a lot of times is it gets what people call leggy or bare-legged. So you will see growth at the top, and about this 1/3 of the bottom, you'll see the actual stems. That's because the top of the plant is so dense that it's shading things out. And this wood is getting very old. And as wood gets older, it gets less productive and just doesn't put on new leaves. The plant only puts the resources where it needs to. So it's not going to put on new leaves there because they don't get enough light to actually provide energy. So one way you can deal with that legginess is you actually reach in through the top of the plant, and you take out long stems. And in essence, you're putting holes in the top of the plant. Why would you put holes in the top of the plant? One, nobody can see it. Two, it allows light to penetrate through the plant and encourages growth at the bottom. And by cutting a stem down to here, we talked about where is the growing point? Well, the growing point is now down here. So when this stem puts on new leaves, it's going to put them on down here, which alleviates some of that leggy effect. If you've had an inkberry for a long time and have never done this, it might not cure that. And you might just have to take stems little by little until all those old stems disappear and you have all new stems. But if you have an inkberry that's new in your landscape, this is something you could do. I'm just showing you an example in a landscape. I didn't have before and after listed there, but I'm going to tell you which is before. This is before and this is after. So I talked about maintaining the natural form of the plant. I'd like to think that it doesn't look, if you haven't seen this plant before, you don't necessarily know that it's been pruned. And that's how I prefer when I'm in someone's landscape. What I've done is to get rid of things that are in front of the window. I've gone in and found these tallest stems. I've gone down into the plant and removed them. This also was to stop that legginess I mentioned, because this plant has been in the landscape about 3 years, I think, and it's starting to exhibit the legginess. But by doing this, it should preempt some of that. I have a picture here. I should have had a ruler next to it, but I'm trying to show you how long those stems are. They're not little pieces that are taken out. It's sometimes all the way almost to the bottom, but I found a growing point. If you can't see a bud, you can guess pretty close where one might be down there, just because of the way they space out on the stem. But this isn't little trimmings at the top, this technique. You could do this probably. Somebody had a question about euonymus. This might be a technique you might be able to apply to a euonymus strawberry bush. You might be able to take some of the tall stems out and get it to regrow from the bottom. I'll explain later why that might not work, but this is an Arrowwood Viburnum, Viburnum dentatum. You can see the leaves are dentate, they call them, these teeth, and they're kind of arrow shaped. This plant wants to grow like 10 to 15 feet tall, and eventually it arches like many viburnums do. It puts on a lot of new growth at the base. How can you prune this? Well, if height is your problem, you can use that cane pruning technique I mentioned and bring those taller stems down to the ground. The plant is going to regrow from the ground those stems, and you won't notice those for a couple of years, and something else will be tall, and you'll take care of that later. Viburnums are really hard to prune for height by just cutting at the top. And the reason is those growing points we mentioned, where things are just going to grow. So every time you cut it, you're going to end up with 2 new shoots where you cut 1. So it now doubles. It doubles your problem in essence. This is the same for all viburnums, whether they're native or non-native. So think of that as you look at your viburnum. This was a question that was submitted, and I believe this was a Viburnum dentatum. It's a little hard to tell in the picture. There's actually one other species it could be. So hopefully the person who sent this to me could give me a closer picture. But if it is the Arrowwood Viburnum, it's going to be 10 to 15 feet tall. If you don't mind it in that location, and that's what it's going to do, then you can let it grow. If not, if density is an issue, instead of managing for height, you can just take out areas that are very crowded. If you want it to stay shorter, you can use that technique we talked about where you're taking the tallest ones only. If it doesn't work in that place, you can transplant it. If it is an Arrowwood Viburnum, which I'm doubting now looking at the pictures, it could be an invasive called Viburnum plicatum, which is called double-filed Viburnum. So I'll follow up with whoever sent that question so I can tell you for sure. But I think that this was identified as something totally different, which is why I wanted to point it out. This is definitely a Viburnum, and that's what technique you would use. One thing to mention about viburnums that I have here at the bottom, viburnums are not self-fertile, which means they won't pollinate themselves necessarily. So if you have a viburnum and it's not fruiting, you may want to add a second viburnum of the same species, or if you have a cultivar, one that flowers at the same time. That sometimes is a problem people have with getting fruit on viburnums. Smooth hydrangea, this is Hydrangea arborescens. It's the only native hydrangea. There are a bunch of other hydrangeas. This does have cultivars like Annabelle. I can't think of any others offhand, but I know there are more. This wants to grow like 3 to 5 feet. It often though grows in deep shade. If it's in really deep shade, I find that the stems sometimes are not strong enough to support the flowers and they'll flop over. So if that's the case, what you might try is at the beginning of the season, it sounds harsh, but cut the plant to the ground before it grows. And that way the stems don't get so long that they're unable to support the flowers. Fun side note, you can take those cuttings and put them in potting soil and leave them, and they will sprout roots, and you'll have more hydrangeas. So you can double your hydrangeas. And sometimes, though, I will say with some native shrubs I've seen, we often have them in much richer environments in our suburban growing conditions than they would naturally encounter. And that like excess of good stuff for the plants actually is detrimental, and they don't get as hardy and strong as they should, as they normally do. So you might find in some cases, and Hydrangea arborescens could be one of those, that sometimes even in your really nice garden bed, it flops over even with pruning, and that's just because the environment's too rich. Some other native shrubs that people had questions about. These are 3 that I saw that I would say pick what's appropriate for your size in your landscape. And these really don't need major pruning. Just prune as needed. If you see it getting really crowded, we can use the techniques we talked about. You can clear it from walkways, windows, etc. And when plants are small, you can pick the right growing point to, direct it away from a sidewalk or, away from your barbecue, if it's next to your barbecue. But Ilex verticillata, Winterberry is one of these. Summer sweet, Plethora alnifolia is another, and Itea virginica are 3 that I can think of that type of pruning. I wouldn't do heavy pruning on any of these. These 2 grow as suckering shrubs, and sometimes if you have too many stems or if it's too dense, you can select ones to cut to the ground, like the cane pruning technique we talked about. Some of the stems can be shortened, but sometimes if it's a really big stem and you just try to shorten it, it'll look a little funny. So it's easier to keep it over time by managing some of the bigger stems all the way to the ground. So Calycanthus is one of these I can think of, and Aronia. There are a couple different kinds of choke cherries or Aronias that you can do that with. Again, you don't have to cut everything, but just cut the ones that are the problem and cut them to the ground. Some special cases I'm seeing more of in the landscape, like a specialty form redbud. It's, it is a native, it's a funky native. These can end up with weird problems. Like this one had so little pruning that everything got shaded out. So this is after pruning. And the only thing really that was taken out was the dead wood. So that's how much dead wood had resulted from the shading on that plant. So keeping an eye on making sure all parts of the plant are getting light is how you manage something like that. Another specialty case, this is a horrible picture, but another specialty case I've seen is hybrid witch hazels. So if you have, it's not the native straight species witch hazel, but you've gotten the one that fits in your space, Arnold's Promise or Jelena's, Yelena or something like that. What can happen is the rootstock, which is the native Hamamelis, will send up these suckers. And they actually, when they do flower, will flower at a different time and look different than the rest of your plant. If you have something like that happening, and it happens with different species that are grafted as well, it's two different plants that are put together, that are grown together, a rootstock and a plant, you want to cut the other plant, the plant that's the rootstock, you want to cut those stems all the way to the ground because they will outgrow this portion of the plant. And you bought the plant to look like this. And so that's what you're trying to maintain. Somebody submitted this about a red bud, and the question was, it's a multi-trunk red bud, is this okay? And I'm going to say it's up to you. These are called codominant stems. Whenever there are codominant stems, this point, and red buds are notorious for this, they are they often split at this point because of the way the bark pushes up against the bark from each stem pushes in. It's not actually adhere, they don't adhere to each other. And in old trees in the forest, you'll see a ridge that's there, and that's also from included bark. One way you could handle this, I've put a little red line here. Let's say you're going to keep this right stem. You can cut this stem to this spot right here, this year, let it be for a year. And what you'll notice next year or the year after is that a collar will actually form there that shows you where the best place to prune it is. This is a small enough red bud. You could do this over 2 or 3 years and it wouldn't hurt anything. With an older red bud, you might need to move it more quickly before the branch gets too big. You could prune it or you could leave it. It may or may not split in your lifetime. That's just kind of a choice you'll have to make. Hey, am I willing to enjoy it for 20 years? And if in 20 years it splits at that place, am I okay with that? Okay. If not, and you'd prefer a different shape, then that's how you would achieve it. I mentioned Euonymus americanus, strawberry bush. Somebody asked about pruning to encourage fuller growth. These often grow in really dense shade, and that's just the way a plant's going to grow in shade. It just ends up leggier because it's reaching for light. If it's not in a very dense shade area, generally in sun, they can grow a little fuller. Or you can try that technique like we tried with the Inkberry, where you take some of the stems down and try to encourage growth at the bottom. That may or may not work depending on the sun conditions that you have for that plant. Somebody submitted a question about trying to integrate native shrubs better into a landscape yard, various non-natives, more manicured plants maybe. And I don't have a picture of the landscape. I would almost lean towards, when you use the word manicured, I don't know how manicured. And so you might unmanicure some of your other plants. That doesn't mean to make them wild, but try to give them their natural shape, because then everything might be a little more cohesive. But this is a really big design issue more so than a pruning issue. This is inspiration from the High Line. I think the native plants are the more wild components, and there's more structure to things like the walkways and other things. Here's an example from another garden where there are some more formal species, and I've seen this used often where they sort of buffer or create edges where the native species have a little more freedom behind them or just on the other side. So play around with it, look for inspiration at places, and see if you find something that fits for you. Some folks asked, a couple people I think asked about azaleas. Can I make a scraggly azalea look better? It might matter why. If it's a really bad location and it's looking scraggy because of nutrients or things, it might be harder. But in general, azaleas are a species that can respond to what you call rejuvenation, otherwise known as cut it to the ground, which is scary for people. But you do it in the spring. If you do it before the flowers bloom, you'll lose the blooms that year, but it gives the plant more energy because producing flowers is a lot of energy. But you can do it after bloom. Spring, though, is still the time to do it because you need the plant to have the full growing season to grow. Someone submitted a question about Hydrangea, Corsofolia, Oakley Hydrangea. This is a tricky one. It is reaching for light in this instance, and they tend to just be kind of longer species. I would say you could try to shorten some of the branches. What the problem is the pieces are tipping over. You could shorten, you do very selective pruning with oak leaf hydrangeas. You just don't do a lot of pruning with them. They like to be happy and just growing. You could try to shorten some of the stems, and that will give the stems that are remaining time to lignify or add more wood, and that might give additional strength. But that could be a tough one to solve in that location. But it's worth a try if you're willing to. If not, they move pretty well. There was a question about a cherry. I don't think this is the native cherry. I think this might be Prunus avium. The person who submitted it mentioned a single flower. If it was Prunus serotina, which is the native black cherry, the blooms would still be visible and they would hang almost like a bottle brush. They're white, and it would be multiple cherries on this little dangle later in the year when it turns to fruit. I don't remember if the issues were related to branches low that were sprouting. You could prune them if they're not in the way of anything. Maybe you don't need to prune them. In general, forest trees or things like that, if they don't need pruning, I just let them decide on their own what to keep. But obviously, if there are clearance issues or safety issues, if they're small enough branches, less than 3 to 5 inches, you could take those and without having too much effect on the tree.
Hey, Maraea, can I
Yes.
just clarify on that? Because I was a person that sent in that picture. So you can't really see it from this picture, but there are small branches that have cropped up. There's probably like maybe 6 or 7 on all sides, all from about maybe 8 feet up to, where like the larger branches start to branch out. Okay. So I was told by a person that was doing some pruning in my yard that it was a big problem, and then I need to get it all over that. It's in an easement area. So I just wanted your view on, whether he said that all of those smaller, sort of 2 to 3 inch branches that were all over the trunk, up and down, were going to cause
an issue.
Die. Yeah. So I just wanted to get
That's probably what's called is what he's referring to, is that it's called adventitious growth, which is the sort of suckering growth that I mentioned before. Yeah. I think your question mentioned that it was covered in ivy. If I had a guess, I would say it was a stress response to being covered in ivy.
I see.
If it's not next to a house, I don't see a reason why those branches would become a problem. But in general, adventitious growth, if it's like somebody tops a tree and then a bunch of adventitious growth comes, those branches are not as securely attached. And so that can become a risk factor. If, at that part of the tree, I don't think it's necessary in terms of safety. But that was just the tree's response, probably because of the ivy.
But it could probably just be left to do its thing, because it's not near any.
Probably, yeah. In general, if it's not, a safety issue, does it look weird? If it was in my front yard, might I change it? Maybe. I probably wouldn't let it have ivy grow on in my front yard either. But, I think in the forest, you're probably okay. And we can talk more too after, and I'm happy to give you some other ideas about it too.
Okay, thank you.
Someone submitted a question about Viburnum. I don't believe this is a native Viburnum. I don't know exactly which one it is. Maybe Birkwood Viburnum. I don't know when it blooms, but that could be an option. This kind of leggy growth out of the back of a Viburnum is very common. I mentioned that you can't really prune Viburnums by shortening them, because then they double their growth there. So if you don't like these tips, take them, cut them all the way to the ground here. And I don't have your picture where it shows the front, but once you cut those out, you just have that nice shrub on the front instead of with all the things at the top. And that's, it's not necessarily a problem with your plant. That's just how Viburnums grow. It could be a shade issue too, but that's how I would handle those. Try that and see how long it takes before that growth recurs and causes a problem. And I would do that before any other major cuts. This was a question about trees in a kind of a courtyard area. So I just titled this Mature Trees and People. This one's hard. Often the issue with trees tends to be just a conflict between what trees need and people need. It's hard to say whether or not you can prune these trees to 25% or 20%, which is the pruning dose that's listed there. The one on the left looks like a bloodgood maple, which is not native. The one on the right looks like probably a plane tree. It's in the same family as the native sycamore, but because it's planted in an urban environment, I would say it's probably a plane tree. Those can tolerate a lot of pruning, but every time you prune, you're going to get more growth. So I know people often, hey, I want to open up the tree. I want to limit up. I want to do this to get more light. You can do it, but it might not have the effect that you are hoping for. It's hard. That's a hard one. And if you call a tree company, you will undoubtedly find somebody that will prune part of it for you. Whether or not it's great for the tree, I'm not sure. There was a comment about mold, and I don't know if it's referring to what's growing on the tree or on the sidewalk, and maybe it's moss. What's on the tree is most likely lichen, which is perfectly fine. People call about that all the time. There's stuff on my tree. That's normal. That's actually a relationship between the tree and the lichen, and they like each other, so you can leave it there. Moss on the ground. My only other recommendation on the ground would be to, plant maybe, things that can absorb the water more, possibly, but that's not a definite answer. If you want a number of how much to prune, ISA would say 20%. I can see that this tree has already been pruned a good amount in its lifetime, both of them. So I would probably lean less less than that until I could see if there are any areas of a lot of decay already present in the tree, which is important before you make more cuts to big trees. Gosh, I ran through them. Good. And I left, very little time, but still, hopefully, if there are other questions that I didn't get to, you are welcome to ask them now. And, if I didn't answer something besides the cherry question that I'm going to stay on to make sure I talk more about, if you have other questions that come up later, feel free to email me.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. I really love that. We have one question in the chat, which is, do old Clethra annifolia flowers need to be cut off in early spring?
Only if you would like to. It doesn't affect the plant. Some people, a lot of people like to clean up their landscape. I would, I tend to leave things just because I don't get to it, and it doesn't affect anything. So it's aesthetic if you would like to. I wouldn't necessarily go through like clipping them out. There's a point in the spring where they'll be kind of loose enough to pop off. That's probably easier than going through with little clippers.
Okay. All right, we have another question just came in. I planted blueberries yesterday and removed the berries and flowers. Would you have done that? I have Jersey, Blue Crop, and Elliott.
For many fruits, that's what they recommend for the first season. Strawberries, blackberries, blueberries. And the reason they recommend that is you want the plant to put its energy into producing roots in this first season. And it's hard as a person who wants to eat blueberries, but you wait one season and you give the plant a chance to establish itself, and then next season, hopefully. I'm assuming that's what the instructions said. Usually it's 1 year. If you have something like asparagus, it's 2 or 3 years, but blueberries, I think, is 1 year. But if your instructions say different, I haven't planted that variety of blueberries, but that's why I think they recommended that.
Okay.
And I sometimes don't follow those steps just because I don't get to it, but that's the best way to do it.
Yes. All right. So then Jen said, you mentioned slightly pruning Winterberry, but I wasn't clear on that. Can you review? Also, is it possible to keep them shorter?
Sure. So I don't have a good picture of Winterberry. I did have a good Winterberry picture, but it's just all stems, so I didn't give you much. What I would say about Winterberries is they're an Ilex, so they're an alternate species. So they should have alternate growing points. So, if you're wanting to manage one for height, let's say your eventual height that you want it to be is 4 feet, let's say. Hopefully you get there are cultivars like Red Sprite that are naturally that are cultivated to be shorter. And if you're having really big size issues, I would recommend going with a smaller cultivar, because the regular Winterberry wants to get pretty tall. But if it's working in your space with just a little bit of, you just need a little change, I'm going to pretend that there's a stem all the way up here. If 5 feet is your desired height, do not cut your stems to 5 feet. Don't find a growing point at 5 feet. Find a growing point at 3.5 feet. Give yourself some room to grow. Otherwise, if you cut from here and you say, I'm going to find a growing point right at 5 feet, and you cut it to there, in this growing season, it will be more than 5 feet, and you'll want to do it again. So you know, think about it. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned looking at how much something has grown in a season. If you can tell on your Winterberry that it grows 6 inches each season, well, or it has in the past 2 seasons, if you cut it a foot or 18 inches lower than where you want it, that gives you a couple seasons of break or hopeful break or less work later. So find your tallest stem, look down, and you know, let's say that this is your stem that's at 3.5 feet. You would cut it to there, and assuming it's a promising side branch, cut it to that point. And then as it grows from here, it'll take some time to get to your 5-foot point. With Winterberries, you can still go in and take out diseased. Crossing, it depends, you know, the smaller ones have a lot of crossing. A big regular species Winterberry doesn't necessarily have a ton of crossing, but if you see a diseased branch that happens to be too tall, go ahead and you can bring it, you know, much lower down into the plant or cut it to the ground. And if you have plenty of other branches that don't affect the way it looks, you're going to get a new growth coming from the ground as well. So the other thing I recommend about Winterberries is trying to do that over its life. I have one client who has let them grow, and so now they're, I don't know, I'm 5 feet, so maybe they're 7 feet tall. And it's going to look weird this first season when I try to cut everything back, as opposed to if I'd been working on it over the years, it would have a more natural effect. So just be aware that if you have a big pruning job to do in one season, it'll look a little bit, it might look a little bit strange if it hasn't been pruned ever.
Yeah, so the same questioner was saying that it's only in a little sun. Maybe it's been reaching for the sun.
It could be. Winterberries want, you know, they're not a full shade species. They do like some sun. Yeah, plants in more shade tend to reach more, so that could be an issue. But you could try the pruning and you know, see how it works. You may just end up with a short. It's going to grow likely less vigorously too in the shade, although it puts on longer spaces in between its leaves as it's reaching. It doesn't necessarily get as much energy to just burst forth with growth.
Okay, I have a couple more questions here. This one is, do you do consults to look and answer questions?
Yes, feel free to check on my website. I do. You know, I walk with people. I do various things for people. I do like to, you know, if people want to know about pruning, I'm happy to, you know, come to your house and work with you. I think that's the best way to learn how to prune the thing you have and feel confident about it. And then, you know, you don't have to hire me next year. I don't care. You know, I would like for people to feel comfortable with the plants in their landscape and to feel like they can manage certain things. Some people don't have time or energy and they ask me to prune them every year, and that's fine too. But yes, you can email me or, you know, go to the website and it has the same info.
Okay, terrific. And what is your service area?
That makes me wonder where you are.
Well, I didn't know where the questioner was. So.
Got you. So it varies. I'm in Arlington, Alexandria area generally, but I do end up driving out for different. I work with a couple other people pruning too, and that takes me to further locations. It's easier for me if I know earlier in the season where you are, so I can pair it up with, you know, try to be environmentally conscious and not make 2 drives to a far out location. You know, but get in touch. And if for some reason I can't get out to your location, I'm happy to use modern technology and help you in some way, if possible. So.
Lovely. Okay. And now, can you prune Viburnum for width?
For width, meaning you want to shrink the width?
Apparently.
Yeah, you would use the same technique. So though, rather than picking this branch that's too tall, let me see if so let's use this cane pruning shrub as the example because it has more width than that other picture. But you find this branch that's coming out too far and you bring it. I would still, for Viburnums in general, if you have enough stems, bring it all the way in. From my experience with Viburnums, if you take it to an intermediate point, you get double the problem because of that opposite growth. So you can come back and fix one of those opposite growing points. It's just more work. So if your Viburnum is vigorous enough, just cut it to the ground and just bring it in. And maybe you don't cut everything off on this side. Maybe you if you cut off 5 that are here, maybe one of them you shorten because you've still, you know, the math on it is you got rid of 5 and you're going to end up with 2. So you're still winning in the end, I guess. So just see how it looks once you get the most defensive branches or stems out of the way.
Okay. I have a question about suckers. I've read that you need to get all the way down and go all the way back to the tree, to the shrub. And what I'm dealing with is a Carolina rose and had no
Mhm.
idea how far it was going to spread. And so I tried that and it was like hopeless. So now I'm sort of resigned to just clipping them off when they pop up.
You were talking about they're running along the ground and then popping up in other places.
Yeah, but they
Yeah.
run deep enough that to try and get them out and follow that back to the base, it just seems impossible.
Yeah.
Is there any
I
hope
mean,
for this?
I've Rosa palustris swamp rose, and also it's one other one I'm thinking of. They have the same habits.
Yeah.
Have you tried just with a shovel and going straight down along the edge of where you want? Are they deeper than your shovel will go? What I mean is walking around
Yeah.
your plant and just wow.
Yeah, they're pretty deep, and not only that, of course, the darn thing has thorns.
Yeah. Another native species that I've dealt with that does a similar habit is the common milkweed, where it has a very long running root that pops up new growth wherever, and you have no idea that there was a root under there.
Right.
A technique that I've used for that actually has worked pretty well for me so far is to not try to dig that out, because it's in my vegetable garden and I can't dig it out. Is actually just and with roses, it's a little harder, but with many roses, if you reach to the very base of the plant, that's actually where it has the least thorns.
Mhm.
So if you pull that, and it'll almost always just separate from the root. That's the habit of a lot of these things that do that, because they want to preserve the main root.
Mhm.
That's my guess. And so I've tried that with milkweed, and it's actually decreased the number more than my furious digging that seemed to multiply the number actually. So I would try that for a season. It can't be any worse than what you've done so far.
No, it couldn't be.
And so try that and see. I don't know that the root goes away, but it's almost as if the plant realizes that it's not as hospitable a location as it had thought.
So I would
if you
just
can't reach it.
stick my fingers into the ground and feel for roots and cut them off or pull them off.
Or even just if you can, just removing that portion might discourage the growth. I mean, it may just redirect it to another location, but then you can kind of see what it does. And then other areas, if the roots are high enough to shovel, I would just go around the plant, assuming it's not right next to a large tree with other roots, and just kind of cut a circle around it where it's acceptable for you for it to be in. But
Okay.
those are hard in kind of a managed landscape or around where we have to do things.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll give it a try. It's a beautiful plant, but
Yeah.
it's a problem. All right. We got another question came in. Is that the best system for smooth sumac as well? I guess she's talking about the
Smooth
sucker.
sumac as well. Yeah, probably, and not planting it somewhere that it can't do that. Unfortunately, the sumacs are tough with that. You could try that. They might not break off the main root as well, but just being vigorous about cutting everything down in a season, and you might do better. It's a beautiful smooth sumac, beautiful leaves, beautiful color if you can manage it. But yeah, it's the same problem with that one.
Oh, definitely. It's beautiful. Another question I have is I have a smooth hydrangea, and it doesn't seem to matter to me whether I cut it to the ground or don't cut it to the ground or cut out a third of the stems. I've been trying all these things and no difference whatsoever. They always flop.
They always flop. Is it in a really rich environment like a garden bed?
It is.
Yeah. This is a problem that I have with other like herbaceous plants that I've grown that are native. And the only thing that I've found about it is Thomas Rayner. He's a landscape designer. I think he's based in Arlington. He's written some books about native plant design with Claudia Wolf. And I've read in his and another resource that when you have these really rich environments for plants, I mean, if you find smooth hydrangea in the wild, I've seen it along stream banks, like in between rocks, it's really wedged in there, and that's not good soil. So I really think that sometimes we're being too good to them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a rougher place you can put it, maybe try that and see if it responds a little better.
Okay. All right, great. All right. That seems to be the end of the questions. Last chance for anyone else.
And I'll stay on for the cherry person who, just in case to close the loop on that.